Well, after the study and the work that has been carried out within the modules of provisioning and planning or work scheduling, we are going to present and work on a practical case. A practical case in which you can perfectly find yourselves in your usual work. The case is, your manager, your director, asks you to plan the staffing and planning of a care unit. In this case, it has been considered that the amount of work of the nursing team for each patient is 4 hours per day, 70% of this being the nurse's work or the nurse's responsibility, and 30% being the auxiliary nursing care technician work. It is also considered that the work will be distributed as follows. 35% of the work will be in the morning shift, 35% in the afternoon shift, and 30% in the night shift. We also know that in our hospital center, there are 3 work shifts: morning, 8 to 3, afternoon, 3 to 10, and night, 10 to 8 in the morning. And finally, we must also have information on the annual working hours, i.e., the number of annual working hours that each professional must have. A professional on the morning or afternoon day shift must work 1,650 hours and 1,450 hours in the case of the night shift. The data I am presenting is data from a third-level hospital in Catalonia. This situation, this data, this peculiarity, you will have to adapt it to the reality of your organization, of your work agreement. That is to say, of the conditions and characteristics of your center and health system. The first thing we will have to calculate is the number of hours of care that will be generated in this care unit in 24 hours. To do this, we must take into account the number of beds, the maximum number of potential patients that the unit can have, and the occupancy rate. As we have previously mentioned, there were 30 beds, an occupancy rate of 80%. We propose it with a 0.8 and the total number of hours per patient. We have also been told that there were 4 hours. We multiply it, and we get 96 hours. Here I give you a first piece of advice, which is that it is a bit pernicious to consider an occupancy rate of 80% because for there to be an occupancy rate of 80% would mean that there are days when the unit will be at 90% to 95%, and other days when it will be at 60, 65, 70%. What is my advice? Well, when calculating staffing of a care unit, always consider 100% occupancy in all cases. In the event that we have a surplus of nursing or auxiliary nursing hours, we will see how to manage it, but we should always consider 100% occupancy. Having made this correction, we obtained that the necessary working hours in that unit would be 120 working hours in a day. Well, now we will have to divide these 120 hours of the workday and assign what corresponds to the nurse's work and the nursing assistant's work. With a simple multiplication, we can obtain those 84 hours of the 120, given that 70% are nursing work and 36 hours are the work of the nursing assistant. Now, what we will do is divide those nursing hours and those nursing assistant hours into the 3 shifts that we have been given: morning, afternoon, and evening. Remember also that we have been given the percentage of time, or what percentage of care is performed in each shift. So with a simple multiplication, multiplying the hours by that percentage, we get the nursing time and the auxiliary time in each of the 3 shifts, morning, afternoon, and evening. We obtain 29.4 hours for the morning shift nurse, 29.4 for the afternoon shift nurse, and 25.2 for the night shift nurse, and the same for the auxiliary nurses. Well, let's start to complicate it a bit. Let's look at those working hours. Those hours of care that are generated in that unit in each of the shifts. We are going to transform it into the number of professionals that we will need to have every day. That is to say, it is what in Catalonia we call a presence. How many presences will we need to have in our units on each of the working days? This is as simple as dividing the number of nursing hours for each shift by the duration of the annual shift. We were talking about 29.4 nurse hours in the morning shift. We divide it by the duration of that work shift, which is 7 hours. A simple division and we get 4.24. We do an approximation, and we are left with 4 nurses attending. We do the same operation for the rest of the professional groups and shifts. We start now with the calculation of the number of staff, the total number of professionals that we are going to have to hire, and that we are going to need to staff that unit according to the presences that we have just obtained. First, we will have to do a parallel calculation, which will be how many working hours does each of the positions imply in each shift? This is as simple as multiplying the duration of that shift by all the working days in a year. Notice that I am not doing a multiplication of 7, which are the hours of the morning shift, by 365, which is the number of days in a year, but I am subtracting the vacation days. Why do I do this subtraction? Because at least here in Catalonia, vacations are always considered as a month of vacations. That is why it says 31 days. We always cover them with professionals that we hire specifically to make that substitution. Therefore, we do not have to count these vacation hours in this calculation. That will mean we will need 2,338 hours of work for each of the morning/afternoon shifts and 3,340 in the night shifts. With this information, we have to relate and obtain the number of professionals we will need to cover all those hours. This is as simple as dividing the number we have just obtained by the annual working hours of each professional. We have mentioned that there are 1,650 hours of work per year in a morning or afternoon shift. So we make the division, and we obtain that for each job we will need 1.42 people, which would be the staff needed to cover each presence of the nursing team that we are generating. 1.42, as you see in the morning, and 1.42 in the afternoon, and 2.30 people for the night shift presence. We continue. We will have to adapt because so far in these last 2 slides, we have been talking about a single presence, a theoretical calculation of a single presence that we will adapt to the previous calculations in which we had calculated that we needed 4 presences in the morning shift. We multiply 1.42 times 4 by the number of attendances in total, so we need 5.68 in the morning shift for the nurses, 5.68 in the afternoon shift, also for the nurses, and 6.9 in the night shift, and the same for the auxiliary nurses. At this point, we make a small summary and establish that the equivalent staff, that is to say, the exact total number of professionals that we would need to cover the 4 positions of the morning shift, would be 5.68. Logically, when we talk about real people, we must talk about whole people. Therefore, the real staff is 6 people. 5.68. We transform it into 6 people. The same thing happens in the afternoon and the same thing happens at night, taking into account the peculiarity that night shifts are always divided into two work teams or two cycles, Group 1 and Group 2, because there is no work shift in which all the nights are worked. We will see below different options for the organization of work in the night shift, but in all cases, we always talk about two different cycles. So the actual staff must always take into account that we will have to divide it by 2. In this sense, we see that we will need a total of 19 nurses and a total of between 8 and 9 auxiliary nurses. At this point, you, and according to the characteristics and hiring policies of your center, you will have to decide if we take the example of the morning shift nurses, where we have said that there was an equivalent staff of 5.6 and that logically is a real staff of 6 people. We will have to decide to either hire 6 nurses at 100% or hire 6 nurses, but 4 at 100% and 2 with a part-time contract at 85%. I have already told you that this is a decision that you, as the nursing staff of the unit, may not have to make, but is more related to the human resources policy of your organization. In any case, we are going to need 6 nurses for sure. The only difference, the only thing we will have to decide is whether it is 6 full-time nurses or 4 full-time nurses, as I was saying, and 2 part-time. At this point, we start with the work of planning or scheduling once the work of staffing is finished, which is what we have been presenting up to the previous slide. Planning always begins with the choice of a work shift, a work cycle. That is to say, which days of a week or a group of weeks these professionals will work. As I said, or as I commented in the presentation of this module, the planning has to be a procedure done consciously, but in which there is simplicity in the work that is done. When I say that, I mean that it does not have to generate added work for us if we spend enough time, effort, and knowledge in the initial planning of the work of that unit. We will see an example of what we are going to say next, which is the choice, as I said, of that work cycle. When we choose a work cycle, apart from choosing which day and the number of days to work, we have to consider that the actual number of working hours of that person is as close as possible to the planned working day of that person. Why? So that we plan neither more hours nor less hours. If we plan more hours than that person is going to have to work, it will mean that we will have to pay him/her overtime or give him/her compensatory holidays, which will be an organizational difficulty for our work. On the other hand, if we plan fewer working hours, it will imply that throughout the year that professional will have to come to work on additional working days, which sometimes generates a certain dissatisfaction with the workers. Therefore, let's try to make the planned work as close as possible to the actual working day. To do that, what do? Well, a remarkably simple mathematical equation to know how many ideal hours a professional would have to work during a week. And how do we do that? By dividing the number of hours of the annual workday by the number of weeks. The number of weeks in a year is 52, but remember that we have already removed the month of vacation to make the calculation. Here we will do it again. Therefore, we consider that if a year has 52 weeks, then 4.5 weeks, 4.5 weeks, are the weeks that you will be on vacation. Therefore, we take it in the operation That will mean that in a day shift, a person would ideally have to work 34.7 hours, both in a morning and afternoon. For night shift, the working day is 30.5 hours. In order not to make the case too long, we will keep the example of the morning shift. At this point, we will have to put on the table different timetable options to be able to organize our work, taking into account that these time cycles that we are going to plan are going to generate an average number of hours per week. In the first case that we present, you can see that it is a cycle of 2 weeks in which we work 4 days, rest 1 day, and work 2 days again. So that week, we work 6 days, and the following week, we work from Monday to Friday. We work an average of 11 days in 2 weeks. That makes the weekly hours, as you see, 38.5 hours, and the following week, 35 hours per week, which ideally a professional would have to work. We are talking about those 35 hours. That would be a good shift option. You see also that we present you with a morning shift at the bottom of the slide where it's a 3-week cycle where you work 1 weekend out of every 3. That would also be a good option to consider since it fits the 34.72 hours that we saw on the previous slide. For the example we are working on, I have considered that the appropriate shift is the one marked in the blue box. Once the time cycle has been chosen, it will be convenient to apply it to all the people in the team in the morning shift, which is the example we are going to work on, and arrange the time sequence they would have in a Gantt diagram like the one you see in the presentation in order to know which days each person works. Remember that before we also consider what type of working day each worker would have, we need to consider if all 6 were hired at 100% or if, on the contrary, we hired 4 at 100% and 2 were part-time. For this case, I have chosen this option. 4 people hired at 100% and 2 hired part-time at 80%. Let's go first to the people working at 100%. We have applied to them the shift or the time sequence that we have planned, that we have considered previously. You see that it is a cycle of 2 weeks, week 1 and week 2, and in which of the 4 people, 2 working the first weekend and resting the second, and the other 2 rest the first weekend and work the second. Obviously, the 4 people cannot rest for exactly the same days because we would have a huge organizational problem. One day, we would have too many people, and the next day, we would have too few. Having clarified the type of schedule that these people do at 100%, we are going to work with the people who work part-time, i.e., who work at 80%. You can see that these people have a shift type significantly different from the previous ones. This group of people here in Catalonia is called babysitting staff, or staff covering parties, or staff running shifts, or complementary staff. They are people who are part of the team, but their organizational peculiarity is that they have a stable shift in which they work the same days, which always fall on weekends. In this case, we are planning an average of 4 days per week. For example, Monday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and this pattern is repeated continuously. You can see that in the end, we always get 4 attendances, which is the number of attendances that we have initially decided to have in the morning shift. We can do the same in the afternoon shift/evening shift. In this situation, I add here a variable Imagine that instead of hiring people at 80%, your human resources management says, no, all professionals have to be hired at 100%. Well, perfect. It is a great measure to build staff loyalty in this case, and this should not be a problem for us, but it should be an advantage. This situation, the difference between 80% and 100% of the work of these professionals can be managed in two ways, and I present here the first one. As you can see, we have added one more day of fixed work for these two professionals during the week. You see, for example, that Nurse 5 starts working every Tuesday, adding one more fixed day in the week, and Nurse number 6, we have added one more fixed day, which is Thursday. You can see that she also works on 2 Thursdays in this cycle. What happens to us now? Well, before we had a total staff of 4 people, and in this case, we see that there are 2 days. Every week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we have an extra person. We have 5 people on those days, marked in yellow color in the presentation that you are seeing. This is a situation that a nurse manager must be able to take advantage of. Why? Well, to take advantage of those days in which there is a surplus of personnel to carry out those activities that require a reinforcement of personnel, or, for example, to free up some professionals in this unit to be able to carry out scientific activities, methodological work, control of quality, indicators, etc. We can also use these surpluses to cover incidences or planned absences that may occur in that unit or in another unit of the hospital. In any case, the nurse manager knows that there are a few days a week when she has an extra person. We could have another situation, which is that if we also leave those nurses at 100%, but we maintain that their planning continues to be for only 4 days, what will happen with that 20% of those hours that correspond to that 20% difference? Well, these are the hours that the nurse manager will have to agree with these 2 nurses so that they will be doing them in a planned way during the year, but to cover unforeseen incidents. These are 2 ways of working, and both are totally valid. Each organization, each hospital has its own tradition, its own way of working. Choose what suits you best. We continue with what we said before. Once this work has been done, we are considering that all the nurses working in the organization will have a 100% perfect planned schedule. What we will have to do at this point is to know at the end of the year, with this type of timetable cycle that we have planned, how many hours we are going to work, more or work less. To know if we have to ask those professionals at the end of the year or during the year to work some extra days, or if, on the contrary, we must give them some holidays, so that the timetable is adjusted to the contracted working day. How can we do this exercise? Very easy. My advice is to lengthen the whole 2-week timetable cycle for the duration of an entire year. Once this work is done, obviously, it is not presented on the slide because it would not be easy to see it. We see, for example, that nurse number 1 is going to work or is going to have 260 working days planned. Perfect. From these 261 working days, we are going to take out the working days that she is going to do on vacation. This is regulated by the labor agreement, and in this case, in this company and in this invented unit, let's say that there are 24 working days a year. Well, this implies that the actual working days will be 237. If we relate or transform this into hours, They are 1,059 hours. If we subtract this from the annual working days, she will work 9 hours more at the end of the year. That will mean that we will have to compensate or give her a day or 1.2 days of holiday in addition to her vacation for the entire year. Why? To ensure that the working day is exactly the same as the contracted working day. Obviously, and depending on the day and the moment in which this cycle starts or begins to be applied, there will be people to whom we owe 1 day. There will also be people who we owe 9 hours. In addition, there will be people to whom we owe 2 hours. But having 2 hours left is considered a tight schedule. It is a perfect schedule, to be honest. In this case, we're talking about the 2 babysitting nurses or shift runners. The ones that worked on the weekends were contracted at 100%. What would happen if we hired them at 80%? Well, we will have to do the same operation, but taking into account that the vacation days will be different and that the contracted working day in hours per year will also be different. We do the same operation, and we get that these people, we owe them 1.4 days of holiday, or what is the same 10 hours of holiday. That is to say, they work 10 hours more in this initial planning than they should work. Obviously, as I said before, either we pay overtime, which is a very unusual practice, or what we do is to compensate for the days on holidays. What would happen to these people? And I always insist on these 2 people if we have them hired at 100%, but we keep the work cycle of only 4 days. Well, you see, if we do the same operation, these people will owe us 320 hours or 45 working days to be done during the entire year. These working hours are going to have to be organized by the nurse, their manager. Therefore, it is also a good organizational solution in certain situations. We finish here with this presentation. We hope that it has been useful for you. As you can see, it is a work that requires some previous preparation with some previous reflection, especially to avoid problems and avoid organizational difficulties plus complexities. Once the team has started to work, if we are able to establish previously some organizational conditions that are easy, that are positive for the workers, but that for the nurse manager do not suppose an added work, the truth is that you are winning both parts. It is a win-win. Therefore, it is perfect pact. Thank you for your attention. I hope you've been interested, and we will continue.